welcome to Elevating Voices. I'm your host, Joelle Tamraz, and today we have a special guest, Jane Boulware, author of the recently published memoir, Worthy, From Cornfields to Corner Office of Microsoft. On this channel, we get to hear authors tell us about their transformational stories, and it would be great if you could like, subscribe, and share the content so that more people can discover their journeys. Let me start by telling you a bit about Jane. From the cornfields of Iowa, Jane Boulware defied expectations to lead billion-dollar businesses and rise as a top Microsoft executive. By 52, she'd launched 3 major ventures, navigated the US's largest merger, and left a trail of influential leaders behind her. Passionate about empowering others to recognize their worth, Jane is a positive catalyst of change and a dynamic speaker, mentor, and board member. She cherishes time outdoors with her family, and all proceeds from her book, Worthy, are committed to the Boys and Girls Clubs of America's Youth of the Year Scholarship. She lives in Bellevue, Washington. Welcome, Jane.
You called me a special guest and a charismatic speaker. Holy man, that's a lot of pressure.
Well, hopefully don't feel any pressure at all. This is going to be a fun chat. I can't wait to hear a bit more about your story. Sometimes I think of these chats are the story behind the story. And I just want to say off the bat, just so you just feel a bit more pressure, that I loved your book. At the end of reading it, I had a warm, fuzzy feeling from having read that story. And as I was reviewing it, preparing for, our meeting today, I just thought, I need to read this again. And to me, that's quite a high bar for a book because I remembered some of the lessons and parts that I'd really like. So for our audience, Jane, tell us a bit about your book and why you decided to write it at this time in your life.
Well, if you look at it, there's 2 things. One is that it doesn't say Jane Boulware, look what she achieved. It's called Unworthy. And actually the un is crossed off, so we call it Worthy, but it's stories of overcoming. It's 50 short stories throughout my life. So it's not I did this, then I did this, and then I did this, and look how great I am. It's actually a lot focused on the un and worthiness, because I learned I was born the 4th kid, in a rural 4th kid in a 5 in a 1-bedroom house in a rural community in Iowa. And I had an unconventional career path, to be sure, and achieved a lot of things, to be sure. But throughout that, I struggled with the internal conflict and put a lot of barriers in my own way to success. So the book is a lot about overcoming the uns, unworthiness, unable, unpowerful, incapable, because when it's only when you remove the uns that you are powerful, capable, able, worthy, etc. And so the stories are meant to be relatable to people, funny, very, very honest and truthful, so that people can see themselves in the story and hopefully rethink their own opportunities in the way that they think about their own potential.
Yeah, that explains part of why it resonated so much. And as a memoir author, how did you decide what made the cut? Which stories, you included and which you didn't? What was your writing process like?
Geez, that's a great question, because you may not like this answer. I didn't intend to write a book. I promised when I left Microsoft that I would write my stories down because I love telling stories. And in the process of writing the stories down, they became alive. And they became a way of me sharing the experiences that I had in such a way that hopefully others would see themselves and realize that they're not alone. And I actually had a couple of pivot points during the creation and the writing of this book. The first was when someone sent them on to, and I forwarded them on to Random House, and they were interested in publishing the book. But they wanted to get rid of these stories over here about, worthiness and my childhood and focus more on these stories up here about Microsoft and Bill Gates and kind of a tell-all, if you will. That's how I wrote the book. So I had
Yeah.
to take a step back and say, gosh, it'd be awfully nice to be published by someone besides, because I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But what's the intent of the book? And the intent was to share my personal experiences of overcoming and make enough money to help fund scholarships for kids who need it most. And when you do have someone publish it, you lose control, you lose a lot of the proceeds. And so I decided that was one pivot point, not to go with the
Mm.
publisher. The second pivot point was some of the stories, people will tell me they snorted with laughter and they sobbed with crying. And
Mm.
the best compliment is that they can relate to it. And part of that was me sharing the parts where I was really down, where I was really struggling personally and professionally. And deciding how much to share was a really big decision for me and for my husband. I took some stories out that had to do with others in my family or him or whatever, because he said, those are our stories. I don't feel
Mm.
comfortable with sharing them. And some of the stories from my childhood, I took out after sharing with my brother, who said, stories are true. Are you sure that you want to share these? Because it will impact the people who are still with us. Um, and I asked myself the question, does it make a difference in telling the story in total? And if it didn't, I took them out out of respect for the requests of others. But if it did, I kept them in.
And do you think through that process of editing is how you honed in this very particular voice that you have? I mean, that's what an author makes an author special and a book really captivating. And you nail a very engaging voice that marries, I would say, wisdom with humor. There's wisdom particularly for me at the end of each what you call story chapters. There be almost a takeaway. How did that come about? Your voice.
I don't know how to say this, but that's the way I talk. It's like my friends, that a good compliment is they'll say it's like sitting there and listening to you talk. And my intent was not just to tell stories, but tell stories in a way that someone would take something away. So in the process of writing the book, doing mentoring, giving speeches, whatever I've done through my career, I've tried to use my own experience in a way that others can relate to, which isn't that hard because I'm, at the end of the day, a pig farmer from Iowa. So I don't use big words. I don't think that complicated. I try to boil down things and just say it like it is. That's
Right.
what I do.
And you described the experience of being a used carpet salesman as one of the most meaningful jobs you've ever had. I find that fascinating. Tell us a
Hmm.
bit about that. How you gave yourself that job, because I know you didn't get that job. That was your own business. Tell us about that with everything you've done. Why the used carpet salesman?
Yeah, I've had a lot of lofty titles, C-suite, and I mean, I've had some really lofty titles. But the title that I really relate to the most and am most proud of is used carpet salesman. And the reason for that is because, and for context for someone that might be listening, I went to college, I was dirt broke. I had a lot of jobs, but I still was having a hard time paying for tuition because I paid all my own college. And so the dormitory that I was living in had ice cold floors. They were tile, they were cold. And my dad he laid carpeting for a living and used to keep the scraps in the garage of our house. And the floor was so cold, someone said, gosh, if only this floor was carpeted. So I went back to my dad's garage and asked if he would teach me how to put the scraps together. And you literally seam them with glue. There's a way to do it. It's what he did for a living. And I created carpet scraps, rugs out of all these scraps. They looked ridiculous, but they were kind of fun. And I sold those from the back of my car. I drove them back to college and literally sold them from the back of my car. and made enough money to pay my tuition. So the reason I love that is I thought of a creative solution to a problem. I overcame my biggest fear, which wasn't selling something and wasn't any of those things. It was asking for help. In my family, you could do something, you could, help someone, you could tell someone what you were doing, but you never asked for help. It just wasn't done. And that's what I did. I asked my
By
dad for
asking
help.
dad, in
Yeah.
that case, did it
So
bring you closer to each
it
other
did.
by
It
asking?
did. I mean, I think he was so surprised I asked for help and he smiled. And over several weekends, I came back and forth between college and my hometown, and he helped me. And, he said he'd never pay for college, but he gave me a way to do that. And so not only am I proud of the title used carpet salesman, but it makes me smile and think of my dad. It makes me realize that sometimes the solutions are right there. They're just not what other people see. And that what you bring forward is unique and special to your experiences. So don't underestimate them. There were a lot of lessons in that.
Definitely. Now, changing gears a little bit to, I think this goes more into your corporate career. You said you've been called a bulldog, a bitch, an idiot, and brilliant all in the same week. How did you learn to navigate criticism and praise?
Well, praise is pretty easy because you don't get it that often. So you pretty much relish it when you do. But praise sometimes is really hard to hear if you're coming from a place of feeling unworthy. You tend to dismiss it. And to be truthful, women have a hard time and are likely to either dismiss their own achievements or downplay them or give them to someone else, truthfully, and say, oh, that was them, and then you dismiss that. So being able to say, yes, I did that and I'm proud of myself, thank you. And to own that is a skill that's really, really important to be learned for everybody. But I think the research would show, and the McKinsey study and the Harvard Business just came out with a study on this, that it's particularly challenging for women and holds us back in our careers. Because if you don't own what your achievements, you don't get recognized for them, you don't get promoted. So that's the first thing. That's praise, which probably is not what you expected to hear, was the hardest. Criticism used to bring me to my knees. It used to really be something I'd swirl in. And the research will show through Gottman Institute, if you don't say 5 positive to every negative, whether it's your husband, someone you're working with, anyone, all they take away is the negative. They don't take away the positive. So someone can say 4 things positive and 1 thing negative, and the average person will spin on the negative. And oftentimes when we say, you did this great, but this, forget what you did great, you focus on the but this. So criticism. I have gotten a really strong core. I feel I'm worthy, regardless of how well I did. If I failed, what I did failed, it's not me that failed. There's a big difference. So remembering that. Also, labels. Being called a bitch used to be something that I would just feel either really bad or I'd just fight against. I'm like, yeah, okay, I see okay, that's on you. But you can put that bitch crown on my head, but I don't have to wear it. You can badge me, but I don't have to wear it. So I choose what criticism to accept and learn and grow from and which ones to dismiss, truthfully. And I think that's our right to do, but it starts with knowing that you are worthy as you are. And honestly, whether you do well or don't do well, it's a learning thing. The last thing I'll say on that is I used to be afraid of being afraid. I didn't want anyone to see that I was afraid. I'm not afraid. I can do this. I'm fearless. What a fraud. Everybody's afraid. If you're putting yourself in a position of stretching and growing and being uncomfortable, you're going to be afraid, and it's okay. And now I recognize that being afraid is nothing to be afraid of. It's okay.
What point did you make that shift from feeling unworthy, we could call it, to worthy?
I'd argue that I'm still making that shift, to be truthful. I mean, I don't think there's any point in your life where you're feeling 100% secure and you have it all figured out and you're not afraid anymore. If you're not afraid, you're not putting yourself out there and stretching and growing. I have no idea how to promote a book. I don't know what I am doing. I didn't have a clue how to publish this. And I'm trying literally in real time to put it on Audible. And it's like, holy cow, there's a lot of steps. And that's
Have you
okay.
read it? So I don't want to get back
I
to.
did.
Have you read it out all yet for
I
Audible
did. I did. And at first it was
in your own
really
voice?
weird, and then it was really fun.
Great.
Um,
That should
weird
be.
and fun. Weird and fun.
Yeah. Okay.
So I am oftentimes saying, what am I doing? My husband says I'm failing at retirement because I keep putting myself out there.
Yeah.
I always will. I tell him now because I used to think, oh, I should be retired. I should be not doing some of these things. But when your purpose and your passion is what you call work, I'll be working the rest of my life. I love this. And so I still feel unworthy of times where I am with someone that I think has it all figured out, or I feel as though I put pressure on myself that I should, do more than I am. When I was little, I had a pickle bucket and I tried to fill it as best I could with all my achievements and my ribbons and my accomplishments and everything else. And sometime I think in my 50s, I really started to appreciate after I had been demoted from a prominent job that it wasn't about what I put into the pickle bucket, it's what I took out. And when I started
Mm,
realizing that shift is when I started becoming more confident and capable of my own worth. Because to give away your talents, to give away your time and your treasure and your talents, you have to fundamentally believe there's something that about you that is worth giving, that someone else will
mm,
benefit from.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm. It really does. Thank you for that. How long ago did you retire from your corporate work?
8 years ago, 7 years
Okay.
ago.
And and did you start writing, was there a gap where you took a bit of a break, or did you start the writing
Oh,
process immediately?
see prior comment about failing in retirement. I kept mentoring. I joined a board and became the chair of the board within 9 months. I joined other boards and helped with startups. I had to learn because I had been so um, busy in my job and I had to learn to unwind. And it took me a little while to do that. And telling my story and writing first was something that I had to do. And then it was something I chose to do. And then it became a gift. So I
Yeah.
had to go through that shift. And
Yeah,
now it's,
having done something similar, I can relate to
yeah.
that process. Did writing the story change your views on some of those events?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It didn't change what happened, but here's an example. Writing the stories early in my life were easy to tell in story format, discrete stories.
Right.
Kimberly Clark, fairly discrete stories. When I get to Microsoft, it was such an emotional crash for me
Mm,
and so challenging on so many fronts that I couldn't write stories about it. What I wrote about was how I felt and situations that I was in, but discrete stories were munched together. And I
hmm.
wrote about that and I shared early on my stories with very few people. And one of them was my son, my younger son, Jack, who was probably 20 years old at the time. Don't know why I shared it with him. I think he literally picked it up while I was writing and said, "This is really great, Mom." And I said, "Well, go ahead if you want to read it." And he picked some stuff up. And he said, "Mom," came back to me and said, "Mom, this Microsoft isn't your voice. It's not you." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He says, it's not your voice. I don't think when you read this in the future or when someone else reads this, that it's you they're reading. It may be how you feel in this moment, but it's really not you. And in the process of doing that, he basically said, you have some work to do to process what happened and to share that in a way that is who you really are, and not, and go, and it changed my voice from my early years to Microsoft. And
Yeah.
so in that way, the stories were the same, but how I looked at them, the lens through which I looked at them, my attitudes, etc., changed. And I, even now, a couple of years later, I have stories. I've distanced myself and I remember the stories. And what's been a joy for me is the people that have reached out and shared those stories and then added to it and say, remember, this is what we did from that. And it's been a
Yeah.
joy to make that a collective memory.
That you put into the writing,
I put it
or
into
is it
writing, or I put into, when I'm putting into speeches, or I am putting into stories for if there's a book two.
okay?
Which I know, you're
Yeah.
not supposed to write book twos on memoirs. I get that, but they're kind of
Well,
stories. I don't know.
you can, you can.
I think
There are
so.
serial memoirs.
It's interesting because I don't think of this as a memoir, but it really is. It's stories from my life. So I
What
guess
do you
that's
think of it
officially the
as?
definition of a memoir.
What do you think of it as, your book?
I wanted it to be like if I'm sitting down with you and I'm sharing my experiences in a way that I hope will make you struggle less. So but it's not self-help. I don't know you. I'm not the writer. It's interesting because I don't think of myself necessarily as a writer, but I love to write. And I think it is well written to the best of my ability. And I guess that makes me a writer.
You
So
wrote it. It's very well written. You are a writer. I think that impulse that you wanted to write it is number one. Number two, that you did it beautifully.
thank you.
And number three, that you're proud of it and want to write another one. So absolutely. And it's funny you use the word self-help, because I wrote some notes here and I said in my assessment, I said that what you wrote is not rose-tinted platitudes of self-help books. That's the struggle with self-help books. They are trying to get an idea across, and it's usually only focused on that. Whereas with your book, you're showing us what you went through, some fun moments and a lot of difficult moments.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those are on the page. And I think that's where you're gaining our trust as a reader, that you're being honest.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not your typical executive memoir. Um, we know that you have ended up in Microsoft because it's in the subtitle, but you don't reveal that that's going to be really hard. And your trajectory is fascinating. It's almost like the three sections of your book have a real way that they stack on each other. And it's interesting you said it was hard to write about the Microsoft part, because it comes across as very much continuous to the rest of it, although there is almost this boiling point. Without giving too many spoilers, although I've been given the message that spoilers are part of this business, so you have to
Don't
get
worry about
used to it. But yeah, there's a big betrayal moment in the Microsoft section. Was that, with with your boss at the time and not giving you credit for your work? That's huge. I happen to have worked in a corporate setting in senior roles as well. Could relate to
it.
a lot of the scenario situations that you described, and that is the classic no-no in management for your team. I'm surprised more managers don't just, blow the trumpet of their team members, because it lifts everybody up. That betrayal moment, was that a turning point for you, would you say? And can you share a little bit
Oh,
about that?
absolutely it was. The scenario was I had come into Microsoft. I had struggled to gain traction. I had been given a new opportunity. I had been doing really well in that opportunity and was about to present it to those people who were major decision makers, heads of the company. And right before I presented it, I got sidetracked and someone else took credit. And the betrayal was significant because it was going to be my redemption, personally and
Mm,
professionally, because the person that betrayed me or that took the credit, also I considered a friend who knew of my journey.
Mm.
And so I felt buzzsawed. And the reason it hurts so much, Joel, is that I had twisted myself into a pretzel to fit the mold of Microsoft until I was salty and crusty. And I realized that even though I twisted myself and thought I had become what would be acceptable to them, still it wasn't enough. And what I was left with was not just defeat or not just failure, but what I felt was an empty shell. Because what
Mhm.
had gotten me to the corner office, what I valued in lifting other people up, I had foregone, essentially.
Mm.
And that was
Yes.
what crushed me. And it was actually, I use the expression throughout my book, don't use someone else's yardstick to measure your success.
Yeah.
If someone says, I could never do that, you should never do that, you can't, won't, or shouldn't do that, I don't, that's about them. That's not about me. But when I got to Microsoft, I took their yardstick for success
Mm.
and I hid mine so that I could fit in. And even that wasn't enough. So the moral of that story is you need to claim your own yardstick. You need to succeed in a way that is consistent with your values, your things. And that was a pivotal moment where I said, if I were to stay at Microsoft, I am wearing the clothes that I feel comfortable in. I am acting in a way that is true to my yardstick for success. And shockingly, when I made that decision, it resulted in a demotion. And after that, I became the leader that I wanted to follow. And our success in the team, our success on the business absolutely exploded.
Great. No, that's a
So yeah,
good
that was a pivotal moment.
that you learned that, but it was a hard lesson. And I know in the
Oh,
book we so about your leg, and it had a lot of
there
personal.
was a
Your
lot.
broken.
There was a
Yeah.
lot that was happening at that time, physically and emotionally. I literally say in that part that I was lying in my closet in a fetal position, having a snotty
Mm.
howler, a crying fit, because I just did not know. I was crying for all that pent up feeling and
Mm.
emotion and that I had felt for quite some time. And it was actually someone else. It was my husband who helped hand me that yardstick for my success and helped me back up. I think we all need that, whoever
Yeah.
that person might be in our lives, to reflect that mirror of who we really are and the good things in us back to us. And that's a lot of what mentoring is, or
Mm.
hopefully marriage. Although I
Yes.
focus more on the dirty dishes sometimes.
Yeah, indeed. What was the hardest part to write, to put into the book that took the most for you to include?
The things that were the most painful,
Mm.
obviously. There's a story about my dad and I when I was a child that was unresolved, that was very difficult, that because I wrote the story, I then resolved with him really well. I wrote about my bulimia, which was a deep, dark secret that I didn't want anyone to know, even myself. And my kids didn't know it. My husband really didn't understand it until I wrote the book. And then finally, sharing my demotion and how that came about at Microsoft and my perceived failure there until some redemption was also difficult to share because people look at the outside Jane and they're like, she's confident, she's got her shit together, I want to be, whatever. And sharing those moments of vulnerability were humbling, and it was hard and it was real, and I felt all those feelings again, and I put them on the paper, and I was like, ugh, this is real, this is not shiny, it's not pretty, it's my bits and scraps and ugliness and how I felt, but also how I healed and how I learned and how I grew and what happened from it. That's why you don't see a lot of memoirs like that, because people are still aspiring to the next level. And I had to, that's the point with that boss where I finally decided it's not about how high I can get. It's not about how much I can achieve. It's about how much I can help others achieve. And that was a pivot point. It's not a do these 5 things and you'll be this. It's not a precursor to now attend my program. Now hire me to do this. It's not like that. I'm donating 100% of the proceeds to Boys and Girls Clubs. So you betcha, I want to sell as many books as I can, because the more books that get sold, the more kids get to go to college or whatever their future might give them.
And at what point, tell us about making that decision. Why? And when did you, was that right from the beginning or did that come later? Tell us a bit about that.
The truth is, when I was in high school, when I was in school, a gnarly old nun pulled me aside one day and said, "What are you doing after you graduate, Jane?" And I fumbled around with my answer, but the gist of it was, I don't want to be where I'm at. It's great, but I don't want to stay in my small town, but I have no clue where to go, how to go, because I'd never seen the world. I'd never seen the ocean. I'd never seen a forest. I'd never been to a big town. And she said, you should go to college. You should go to college for forestry, because I love the outdoors and I loved science, even though I'd never seen a forest. And there's a scholarship I think you should apply for. And it was only $320, not much money. But I got the scholarship, and it was the most incredible validation that maybe, just maybe, someone else believed that I could do something, and maybe I could. And that opened the door to a world I didn't even know existed. So I became involved with the Boys and Girls Club because many, not all, but many of those children come from circumstances where their forward look is not that dissimilar than to their backwards look, which is not great. And they're surrounded by positive people, which is wonderful, like my gnarly nun. But without the money, without the means to take that next step, that's where I come in. And that's why I decided I'm involved in Boys and Girls Club. I'm going to get this book. I'm going to get this book written. I'm going to get it published. And every penny I make, every penny that it makes, every penny it makes, I'm going to donate. So I'm eating all of my expenses. It's my donation, my labor of love. And hopefully it'll make a difference. And I'm paying back that gnarly old nun, maybe.
I really think it is a fantastic book. So I'm not just putting a plug here because of what you said. I really mean that. And it's one of the
Thank you.
things to give to friends.
Thank you. And if anybody
One
has
last question
opportunities
for
for me to speak or anything like that, as you
yeah,
can tell, I love talking. So
you like talking, but we also like listening.
thank you.
So
I'm
tell
trying to
me,
spread the
what?
word of
Yeah,
worthiness.
yes, yes. Um, I have a question for you. Can you speak a bit about the role of faith in your life? Do you feel comfortable talking about that?
I was born and raised Catholic, as was my mom and the mom before her, generational Catholics. My world was surrounded by statues of saints, pictures of Jesus on the wall, and it was the anchor, the foundation. I went to a Catholic grade school and high school because that was expected. I paid my own tuition, mind you, but it was in our town, most of the people were Catholic, and that's just the way it was. You didn't question it. And that was a really wonderful, beautiful thing to have a shared community. As I grew older, I kept my faith, but lost some of the religion, the organized religion. And I find my faith more like, if you're familiar at all with, Saint Francis, find faith in nature, find faith in all things. I am very, very nature centric, and I find my faith and experience my faith not only in nature, but in other people. And so while I still appreciate and recognize, and many of my friends are Jewish, I identify with that faith. There are many faiths that I identify with. My faith has been central to who and what I am. When I have a major decision to make, I look within and look for guidance. Actually, every day I ask for guidance. May I give what I have? May I receive what I need? And go from there. My faith is woven throughout the book. The faith in a higher power, the faith in God is It's not a religious book. But it is central to who I am, and it's reflected on the pages.
Yeah. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like to share before we
The
close?
only thing I would share is that the intent of the book was really to help other people realize that they're not alone, that their fears, I call it FUD, fear, uncertainty, and despair, FUD, that whatever FUD you're feeling is okay. You're not alone, and you are worthy as you are. And that it's not what you have or haven't done, it's what you can and will do. And the gifts that you are, the person you are, those gifts need to be shared. And in the process of sharing, in the process of doing difficult things, you will think of yourselves differently.
Mm.
And I think that's exciting that we continue to grow, continue to both need and give. And I hope that that's what you feel when you read the book is hope, inspiration, some fun and funny, but also some sense of connection.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you for sharing your story, both in the book and with us today, with our viewers and listeners. And yeah, I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to
Me
speak.
too. Thank you for inviting me to share with you. I really have enjoyed this. You're pretty cool.